Hello everyone, I'm your host MX2, and in this video we'll be going over the release log for Boxcutter 719_7. Quite a bit has happened in this update as compared to the last one, and it's definitely recommended that you update both HardOps and Boxcutter at the same time if you're updating for Blender 3.0 and you're a user of both products. For this update, our main focus was improving Ngon points to get them to the point where you can now bevel points during the extrusion process. However, over the course of this update, bevel has been completely disassembled and we're still in the process of reassembling it and getting it to the level that we want it to, but bevel is at least now in a slightly better state, but we do expect greater improvements to happen over subsequent improvements. Set origin has seen some improvements. Grid now is capable of returning whenever you release control and press control again during draw, which is a long time bug. BC Smart Apply has now been expanded in addition to multi-use now working the way users have probably always wanted it to. Sort now is no longer affecting modifiers that are not in its purview, which means that it should now behave a lot better with things like multi-res, collision, particles, etc. However, the main focus is that Accucut is now working better than ever, meaning that multi-res now doesn't result in a canceled error, even though you really shouldn't be cutting multi-res shapes with Boxcutter to begin with. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this release log and begin going over what is new in Boxcutter 719_7. So starting this video, we are using Boxcutter 719.6, which is the last release, and we're also using 2.83.18, which is an older LTS, just for demonstration purposes. And I'm just going to look at this from front view, press D, and change over to Ngon, and just click and drag, and then from here, just click to drop points. And from here, I can just right click in order to stop this shape. And now we're in this pause mode. So now that we're in this pause mode, I can of course click and drag to translate points. However, one of the focal things of the Boxcutter 719.6 release was the ability to use middle mouse button in order to bevel points. However, one of the limitations is that the first bevel that we do will set the pace for the rest of the beveling that's being done. So we see that now that I've beveled this point, that this particular point, whenever I attempt to bevel it, is only able to go as far as this point was. And same thing whenever I attempt to bevel this should be able to go a lot further. However, it's limited due to us first beveling this. In addition, whenever you extrude the shape, you're no longer able to use the middle mouse button in order to adjust the bevel. Even if we were to bring the shape back into a 2D point, we're still not able to use the middle mouse button in order to adjust the bevel on this. So this is something that was a bit of a limitation and something that we sought to resolve. So now that we've went over what's going on in Boxcutter 719.6, let's minimize this, where we now have Blender 3.0 and we're using the latest release 719.7. From here we can press D and jump over to Ngon, and I'm going to look at it in front view, and first I'm just going to click and drag to create the first line, and then release left mouse click and move my mouse, click, 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 and then click to set my last point, and then right click in order to drop it. From here, we're going to do the same thing as before. I'm just going to bevel this simple point, this single point, and we see that, it's a very slight bevel. But notice now that whenever I bevel other points, that I'm able to bevel it outside of the range of what was specified here, which is a massive improvement compared to before. And we're still able to adjust these to be as large or as small as needed, expanding far beyond the limitations that were set at the very beginning, just showing that bevel is a lot more versatile. And the best part is that if we were to extrude this shape, we can still use middle mouse button or shift and left mouse button in order to lessen the amount of weight and adjust this inside of extrude. Another thing also worthy of mention is that if we just begin adjusting our bevel and we begin meeting the other edges, we see that there's like this kind of dynamic effect where it attempts to make these weights work together. So we are doing some improvements in that regard as far as getting these things to play together, but just want to show that now extruded points are able to be beveled in addition to being able to adjust your subsequent beveling far beyond the initial points. Another improvement that was had with Ngon points is this relationship with the mirror. So here we are using the previous version of Boxcutter 719.6, and I'm just going to draw a simple shape. And once we have this in a pause state, I can press 1 in order to activate mirror. However, I can also press Shift 1 in order to flip which side is mirrored. So here we see that when I press 1, I mirrored this side, which I don't want. So I press Shift 1. I'm going to mirror and keep this side and mirror to the other side. But we also see that in addition to mirroring it, that the points are being shown for the other mirrored side, even though this side isn't actually capable of having these points modified. And we could see that in action whenever I attempt to move these points, that it exposes a bug, because these points are simply not real. So if we press 1, we see that we have ruined this shape beyond recognition. However, we can attempt to rebuild it back using point translation, maybe to something like that. And here we see that when we mirror, there are no points showing. But if we were to, say, press G, maybe then press 1, we see that we have a couple of points actually showing for the other side, but moving them on the mirrored side don't actually do anything. So it's just a bug, if anything. So this is something that we did resolve in this latest update. So just to show this from front view, I know this can be a little confusing, but it's just something that kind of irked me. So here we have our shape drawn. If we press 1, we see that we've mirrored on the x-axis. However, we drew this on the y-axis, so that means that I have to press 2 in order to mirror on the y. The dots that are being displayed are the dots for the actual shape and not for the mirror instance. So even though I'm modifying it on the other side, you can't really see much happening because this is on the other side of a mirrored object that's being modified by a bisect mirror. We are actually modifying this accurate to what the shape actually is, instead of before where we were showing fake points that weren't actually correct in the situation. So just a small bug, but it's been resolved for this update. So first things first is we'll press N to open the N panel, and we're already under the Boxcutter tab, so we have our help displayed. If I click and drag on the surface, since I'm underneath cut, we are in the cut operation, and we see that there's a hotkey listed on the side for B to begin beveling. So if I press B, I can bevel, where by moving the width in and out, I'm able to adjust the segment count to go from 1 segment to 6 segments, just allowing me to quickly get something a little more rounded if needed. Another thing about the bevel is we see that there's a hotkey of Q, where basically if we press Q, we bring in something called the Q bevel. I'm going to press tab in order to pause the shape, and we see that we have a little bit of a visual overlap, which can easily be resolved by pressing D to bring up the helper, and just by increasing the main bevel just to make it fit. And from here we can then adjust the amount of width that's happening with our secondary bevel. We can also adjust the amount of segments, which I like clicking the quick 1 or 6 to go all the way from the max to the minimum. And we also have an option to enable clamp overlap, just in the event that you want to exceed the amount of clamp that's allowed, which in this case is actually giving us negative results, but there's sometimes are cases in which you may want the clamp overlap to be off. But just like that, that's how you would normally get inside of Boxcutter and begin using the bevel and Q bevel system. Another thing to note is that once you've activated Q bevel on your subsequent draw, if you press B, you already have Q bevel enabled. So we're just clicking and dragging and just pressing B, and it just brings us back to Q bevel, in which we could just press B, tab, go back inside the helper, and we can just turn off the Q bevel, which sets us back to normal. And from here, notice that whenever I click and drag to create the bevel and press B, that now we're no longer getting the Q bevel being interjected. So just like that, you can have it as something that toggles off and on. In addition to the previous aspects we discussed, there's also reverse bevel. So if we draw a box, we can extrude, we could press B to bevel, we could press Q in order to Q bevel. And from here, we could also press Shift F to basically flip the shape and give us a reverse bevel. Alternatively, you could also do this from the helper. To show that in action, let's just draw a shape. We'll press B, tab, go inside the helper, just ensure that we're over the limit. And by clicking this button, we can flip our shape and basically ensure that we give ourselves a reverse bevel. Notice that it's the opposite of a Q bevel, where instead of beveling the interior face, we're now beveling the exterior face. So that brings us finally to this latest feature. Previously we talked about how you can draw a shape and just press B in order to jump into bevel. However, by going into the helper and clicking on the bevel icon, you can also activate bevel as a start state. This means that every time we draw a shape, it will automatically be beveled, on every subsequent drawing. If we press Alt V E, we can make our shape a little bit more distinctive in the viewport so we can see what we're cutting. The next icon on bevel is the bevel front face. By activating this, it means that on every subsequent drawing, we'll be giving every shape a Q bevel. So now we see that instead of having to press hotkeys, we can just draw and it will just automatically add these Q bevels on the inside, which look very nice. The next icon is for the front face or the reverse bevel. So by clicking on that, it means that every shape we draw will have a reverse bevel. However, at this point, you do want to pause it, press D, and go inside the helper and adjust the amount of width, meaning that on your subsequent drawings, you will now have that width take place on your object. So just like that, you're able to jump in and quickly reverse bevel and Q bevel and just standard bevel without having to even press any hotkeys during drawing, just by going into the helper and activating them as start states. So in the previous segment, we went over how you can basically draw a shape, and during the extrude, you can press B to bevel, Q to Q bevel, Shift F in order to flip the shape, Tab to pause, and then from here you have this blue dot that you can use to adjust the width amount for both bevels currently in play. However, my favorite method is pressing D to open the mini helper, where we can actually adjust the segments that are happening on the secondary bevel, in addition to being able to adjust the width individually of the primary bevel. So in the event that you need to get in and make very specific changes, you're able to do that. So with that aside, this version also introduces a new toggle called Bevel Both Ends, which is quite unique because it's currently in a V1 state, meaning it will be improving over subsequent releases. To show it in action, if we click on bevel, we have this as our start state in the helper, meaning that the next shape I draw will not only bevel but have a Q bevel, which will look like this. However, what if I wanted to perform a reverse bevel and a Q bevel at the same time? Well, that is where the toggle for Bevel Both Ends comes in, which means that after drawing the shape, pressing B will perform a refresh that will attempt to bevel both ends. And what this looks like in action is basically this. In the event that we're not in a reverse bevel state, once I press Shift F and then I press B, we see that it actually does come into play, and we actually have a bevel happening on the inside in addition to it happening on the outside. So by pressing D, we can go back in our helper and adjust the amount of segments that's happening on the bevel that's going in addition to being able to adjust the width that's taking place here. So this is something that still is very new, so it has a lot of potential for issues. And by issues, let's take this bottom face and actually drag it up too far, and we see that currently there are some issues with weights colliding in this V1 version that will have to be resolved. So make sure that if you're using Bevel Both Ends, that you definitely give it an adequate amount of depth, because otherwise you'll end up with shading artifacts that can only be resolved by going in and actually adjusting the amount of bevel taking place. But really, it's giving these a proper amount of distance that allows them to both play together. So now we see that we're able to work, but really this is something that we will be improving over subsequent releases. So I just want to point out that these sort of issues can exist. So let us take this time to right click and cancel this shape, and we're going to press D and just collapse the bevel. In addition to having Q bevel enabled, we're also going to choose to have the front face enabled, which is the reverse bevel. So basically whenever we draw the shape, we're now beveling both on the inside and the outside. However, whenever it comes to this interior bevel, I like having a low amount of segments in order to give it something really sharp. And then whenever it comes to the interior, we can actually jump this up a little bit. In this scenario, we see that we actually have 3 bevels in place compared to the previous scenario, where whenever you transition a shape via the B refresh, it actually attempts to use Bevel Both Ends with our initial bevel system. So there are currently 2 bevel systems in place, and over the course of subsequent updates, you'll see one of them eventually take over and become refined to completion, which I'm assuming is going to probably be the latter, because I definitely want individual bevels for all 3 levels instead of sharing it for both the width and the base, and then for the reverse bevel to have its own, which is what we were looking at previously. So just to recap, so if we draw a shape at this point, we now have a very nice reverse bevel happening. But keep in mind that if you go up too far and you have something shallow, you're going to have issues with the V groups colliding with each other, which is something that we're currently looking into resolving. But in action, this thing is actually quite beautiful whenever it comes to getting a very particular type of cut that will be both reflective in your normal matte baking, but also be very well defined. So continuing on, let's just disable the bevel front face, which means that whenever I draw the shape, it's going to just have the Q bevel. In the event that I press Shift F, we have our reverse bevel, and if I press B, we are now using that first system I was talking about. So if I press D, we see that we have our main bevel and our second bevel, and this is the system that will definitely bring you into some issues if you're unaware of its existence. So like I'm saying, this is something we're definitely looking into resolving, but it's part of a very deep discussion that we're having currently about bevel that still continues to this moment. So to recap and show a typical use case scenario, we'll press X and delete this cube, and press Alt W, switch over to Hops tool, part of HardOps, and just bring in our smart box, hold Control, and we will just make some adjustments to the dots to turn this into a panel of sorts, and Alt W, switch back over to Boxcutter, and from here I could just press D, activate bevel, click on Q bevel, reverse bevel, and if we make sure that bevel both ends is enabled, that means whenever I begin drawing, we have something like this happening. So it's always good to pause it and go inside and adjust your specific options inside the D, because there is a chance that it could just go awry like you were seeing in this case. Keep in mind, if you have something shallow, you're definitely going to deal with some artifacting. So now that we have our shape set up via that one, because in a previous update we have bevel retaining settings across uses, now every time we draw a shape, it is now having a reverse bevel and a Q bevel happening, which is something that was on the to-do list, but we had just never gotten around to doing. So from here I could just press Alt X, maybe press A to add a new mirror modifier, and I'm just going to mirror on the X while holding Shift, and then press X to set the mirror back to default, and we're also going to mirror on the Y. Maybe I didn't do that right. A to collapse all these mods, you know, A. So let's go in and make sure that we're on the right modifier. We want to be on this one, which can mirror on the Y. I don't know why we're stuck on that first one. And then with Everscroll, we can just simply recall it, make adjustments to our cutters. And I was actually just now thinking about redoing this entire segment, but it appears that we might be able to steer this to a successful ending. And just like that, we've cut an interior, and you know, just a quick panel just playing with Q bevel, front face bevel, aka reverse bevel, and bevel both ends. So another improvement is with our set origin. When it comes to set origin refers to the origin that is set on your shape after its usage with Boxcutter. So the first option is mouse position. This means that if I were to draw this shape, the origin is going to be set where my mouse first began drawing this shape. So if we shift to live, we see that the origin is exactly where I said, meaning whenever I press rotate, we are rotating from this area. The next option is going to be center, meaning that it's going to use the initial center point of the shape drawn. This one is my favorite, meaning that whenever we draw a shape, if we press R, we're actually rotating it based on the center of the shape. But best of all, whenever we scale, we're scaling in a way where it never penetrates and goes inside of the surface, because the origin point is exactly where this dot is. So if we shift it to live, you can see the origin being exactly where I was saying. In fact, to really exacerbate it, we can enable our gizmo to show the exact location of this. So the next one I want to demonstrate is called bounding box center. This one will actually set the origin to the bounding box of the shape itself, meaning that whenever I click and drag, the origin is going to be in the center of the volume of this particular shape. So if I press Shift to live on left click to apply, whenever I press S, we see that the shape is actually capable of penetrating inside of the surface, even though, you know, we drew it on the surface, which is something I just don't like, but it is there for users who want it. And then the last option is going to be active element. When we enable this one, we're basically setting the origin of the shape to the exact origin as the target that we're drawing on. So this is where you see the gizmo at right now on the target. Whenever we draw this shape, once we shift it to live, this means that when I press S, we're actually scaling in accordance with the same origin of our target. So in a nutshell, that is what the set origin options are at the top of Boxcutter. It's good to be aware of them, but I personally like to keep mine on initial centered for all of my work. So there's this test called Work to Corner that's an alignment test of sorts where basically users will activate snapping, which will give them dots, and then inside the snap panel activate static dots, which will give them static dots. This means that when you hover over a dot and you roll the wheel twice, you're able to basically look at alternative alignment points, giving us this basic shape. So after creating this shape and performing our first cut, we are now basically working the corner. So I'm just going to grab these edges and just bevel them manually, which gives us something like this. And pressing Q, we can just set our origin to face this direction with set origin. So now we have a very specific origin being set for this area, which doesn't really mean anything except that whenever we cut off a section, we now have that same origin set. And whenever we basically draw a box, we want to be able to radiate this around this particular object. So by shift selecting both of them, we can basically perform a radial array. I'll roll the segments down to 3, maybe press A to lower the amount of adjustment, and just like that, we have basically gotten started. However, because of the way that this particular shape's origin is, if I try to mirror this object on itself, it's not going to work out. So I need to select both these objects, and then I can mirror this object across this object's origin, which will give me something that's a little bit more equilateral. And then I could just move it out on this local Y in order to expand it if need be. So from here, now whenever I perform a radial array, we get something that's a little bit more even. So in this update, we improve the ability to use the active element origin set for Boxcutter, meaning that if we draw a shape and we hold shift in order to keep this live, we now have the same origin as the target that we've cut from and the same rotation, meaning that we can now mirror this across itself without having to select a target. And then we're able to just select the same empty and just simply radiate this and perform our array without any sort of issue. I'll press Alt V, E, and E just to make things a little bit more visual. But just like that, we are now in business. So I'm just going to demonstrate one more time. Shift to live, Alt X, we will mirror this, select the empty, and simply just recycle the same empty so we don't have to create a whole ton of empties. So whenever it comes to getting this orientation right, I'll press D and we'll change our orientation from nearest edge to maybe nearest edge. Let's try that again. Let's try local, and local will do it. We'll shift it to live, Alt X, mirror it on itself because it has the same origin. Shift select the empty, radial array, and just like that, we are now able to work the corner a lot easier just using the active element origin whenever it comes to this particular scenario of working around a centralized radial area. So here we are in a previous version of Blender using Boxcutter 719.6, which was the last release. If I click on this icon for grid, that means that whenever I hold Control, I can then spawn a grid on screen that will show. Let's hold Control to spawn the grid, but click and drag, but let's release Control and keep the draw going. And if we press Control again, we see that that grid actually never comes back. And this is something that's just been kind of a long-standing issue, but it's something that definitely has been noticed by a lot of users. So I'm happy to announce that that issue has finally been resolved. Here we're in the latest version, 719.7, and we activate grid. And if we activate grid and we begin drawing, we can release Control. But if we press Control again, we see that the grid actually comes back and we're able to use the grid during the draw process in order to retain snapping in the event that we need it and then we don't need it. So now the draw is completed. Another way to demonstrate this is by bringing up Ngon. We'll Alt V E just to make our viewport a little bit more visible and just begin drawing. And the thing about it is that in order for grid to spawn during draw, you actually have to have the grid up at some point. So now I've actually released the grid and we're just drawing. And now whenever I press Control, we see that I'm able to now once again use the grid. So it's a very small thing, but it definitely is something that is one of those long-standing issues that I'm glad to see finally resolved. Another thing is that even in the process of translating dots, which was recently added, we can hold Control to bring up grid and actually use the grid in order to orient ourselves to a static grid system in the event that, you know, we are needing to get fine with our alignment during this translation process. So I'm just snapping these to the nearest points to just kind of block them off. And then of course, like discussed in previous sections, I could bevel this point even further than that first point, or to whatever amount that I need in order to get this shape to be specifically what I need it to be. So starting off in the previous release of Boxcutter 719.6, next to the behavior toggle is this option for Smart Apply in Boxcutter. And what this refers to is that if we bring up our modifier list, whenever we cut non-destructively, it creates a boolean. However, if we click the apply button, it will apply not only the modifier, but will remove the cutter from the outliner. To demonstrate that one more time, I'll create another cut, and we see that there's a cutter listed in the outliner, and then whenever we click Smart Apply, we see that it is removed. Another interesting thing about Boxcutter is the ability to tab and use Boxcutter in edit mode. So I'll press Alt W to launch Boxcutter. And one of my favorite things about Boxcutter is basically holding Shift in order to shift a shape to live, in which we now have the cutter caught in a live position. And while we're in the edit mode of this cutter, we can click on the apply button, and we've actually applied the cutter and removed it, as well as applied the modifier on the main target, where we're now able to go in and begin making heavier mesh modifications in edit mode. So now that we've reviewed what Boxcutter Smart Apply is about, let's go ahead and attempt to just cut some cuts on the left side of this box, pressing T to solidify, maybe adjust the viewport to be a little bit more visible. And we're just cutting in some just random cuts on the left side of our box. From here, I am just going to perform a slice operation on the opposite side. So this object, as we can see, is the main object. And this object, as we can see, is just a slice of the secondary object. So if we were to basically go through modifier scroll, we see that all of this information is part of the scroll. So there's basically 8 operations in here that are irrelevant to the slice because it has nothing to do with the formation of the slice at this point. Hopefully you're understanding what I'm saying. So basically in Smart Apply, there's a shift option where basically by clicking it, it will retain only the information of booleans that are relevant to the slice operation at hand, meaning that whenever we do a modifier slice, meaning whenever we do a modifier scroll, that we're only able to see the information pertinent to it. So now we've went down from 9 modifiers to, it looks like, only about 7. So if we press Ctrl Z and undo, we can see what it was looking like before. It looks like we had about 8 modifiers. So just by shift clicking the Smart Apply, you can basically limit your slices to have only the boolean information that's pertinent to the slice at hand, resulting in something that's just a little bit more fast and performant whenever it comes to working in the viewport. Another thing is that you can actually use this with a multiple selection. So if we were to slice this area off and we were to slice this area off, we could actually select both of these pieces, shift click the Boxcutter Smart Apply, and if we were to take this in local mode, we see that only the pieces that are relevant to this thing's particular form are actually kept. In fact, it could be a little bit more strict with what it removes, but it is definitely improvement in the right path. In fact, let's check this one. It looks like we could actually hit it one more time. So now whenever we scroll through it, we see that we only have the booleans that are pertinent to this piece actually being formulated in the way that it is at the time of it being sliced. So hopefully users will take advantage of this in the future. Whenever it comes to Blender, there's 2 types of duplicate. There's Shift D, and then we'll use X to place it over to the side, and then there's Alt D, which we'll use Z and place it up above. And the difference between these 2 applies is that this particular apply that was done with Shift D is no longer connected to this object via its object data, and we can see that via this object having no numerical value here, indicating that it's sharing a data block. However, when we click this one, we see that it has a 2, indicating it is sharing a data block, which has this one also showing a 2, indicating they are both sharing the same data block. What this means to us is that if I tab into edit mode and I grab this face or grab this edge and I bevel it, we see that it also takes place on the duplicate. In fact, I can grab this edge, also bevel it, and that takes place on the duplicate. However, when it comes to Boxcutter, things get a little bit trickier. If we were to perform a cut, and then we hit Boxcutter Smart Apply, we see that instead of it actually going to the other object, it actually breaks the data connection. We can of course select this object and then select this object and press Ctrl L and just share its object data like so. But even if we were to change our behavior to be destructive, we're not able to share our object data automatically between multiple objects. Now that we went over the foundation of the situation when it comes to multi-use data, let us open up the latest version of Boxcutter. And from here, I'm just going to do the same example. I'm going to Shift D and duplicate this off to the side, press X in order to constrain to the X axis, select our main object, and then press Alt D and then Z in order to constrain to the Z axis, and we'll place this above. So just like before, if we go to our Object Data tab, we see that this has 2 users, indicating that it's sharing a user with this, and this object is not related to it at all. So let us just perform a cut, let us perform another cut, and click Apply, and we see that now it actually goes over to the multi-use object without having to break the data. So this is a big improvement. I did another video where I went in a little bit more depth as far as what this means to Boxcutter as a whole by being able to work with multi-use data, but this is definitely one of those things that anyone keen on their Blender has definitely noticed as an oddity with Boxcutter, and I'm just glad to see that it's finally been resolved and we're able to cut and retain object data shared across multiple objects. In this case, you see me actually using it in non-destructive mode. However, if we go to destructive, that's when things really get cooking with gas. We can just cut, and we see that everything we do just immediately takes place on the one above because it's just applying it and keeping the object data congruent. So this is something that was a long time bug with Boxcutter over in the 2.8 era, and now as you can see, that issue is something of the past. And so now you should be able to cut just like you've always wanted, retaining your object data linkage. So back in the day, if you would get silly with Boxcutter and you put certain modifiers on it, like for example, if we put a cloth on it and we attempted to do a Boolean cut, we see that it did not work out. In fact, it duplicated the object and caused it to just not work out. So let us just remove this modifier from the object, which requires me to go in the physics panel to remove it. Another one is that if we were to put a soft body on this object and we attempted to draw a box, we see that it gives us an error for canceled, meaning that it did not work out. So we can select this object and delete it, and we still have our main object here, and it just duplicates the object. It's just a bit of a mess. So users have ran into this, trying to use Boxcutter on objects that they're not supposed to. And even though this isn't going to work out anyways in anyone's favor, it is something that we wanted to seek to resolve. So here we are in the latest version of Boxcutter, and if I go to the modifier panel and I just add a soft body modifier to this object and we attempt to do a box cut, we see that everything works just as you would expect, where we're still able to cut, we're not receiving a canceled error, and we're just continuing to be able to go about our day. And best of all, we can press Shift Spacebar and the timeline will play, and we can see the soft body doing what soft body does with our Boolean still existing in the background. So previously we were talking about improvements with sort and its relationship with modifiers. However, Accucut also had some irregularities whenever it came to certain modifiers, and one of those is multi-res. So if we go under a modifier panel, we're using an older version of Boxcutter 719.6, but if we go under our modifier panel, we add a multi-resolution and we click subdivide a couple of times. We're now subdividing the shape using multi-res, which is something generally reserved for sculpting. But let's say we were just being very weird and we want to get in and use Boxcutter. The moment we attempt to box cut, we see that a box has been placed and it actually says canceled at the bottom of the screen because the operation did not work out. And I can just tell you from experience that this is as a result of an issue happening with our sort system. So technically you could just disable it, and then from there you're able to work. However, you'll have an issue with laser cut, and by an issue with laser cut, let's just draw the shape, pause it, and then just perform an extrusion and then click and apply, and we see that that actually goes through successfully. If I were to switch over to circle and we jumped off of the circle, we see that that actually does not work out. However, if we were to jump off of the circle, pause it, and then extrude it, this works out. So the only way around this is actually to go in and disable Accucut, which actually affects the ability for us to calculate a proper distance to place our cutter from the object. So now we'll press D, switch back over to box, and now when we press spacebar, we're able to just cut through this object just as you would expect. However, this is no way to work because it simply is going to cause issues down the road, disabling two of the most important systems inside of Boxcutter. So for that reason, some improvements have been had with this latest version 719.7, and so let's just show it now. So we'll go in, add multi-resolution, hit simple, maybe not simple, hit subdivide a couple of times, and then from here just begin performing our cuts. And we see that you shouldn't even have to go in and modify any parameters in order to do this, but really you shouldn't be cutting a multi-resolution mesh with Boxcutter, since this is something generally reserved for sculpting. But for those users who just happen to use Boxcutter on a multi-resolution mesh, just know that the issue that you were previously experiencing with it causing a canceled error has now been resolved. So during the extrusion process of Boxcutter, you can press Shift T, and that will put you in the modal state of taper, where you can basically taper your shape. You can also press D and go into Helper and enable taper as a modifier, and then from there begin actually jumping through to quick preferences where you can taper the shape on the fly. In fact, there's a adjustable drop down where you can expand it and choose various things, from making it persistent and the new option of keep lattice. Basically, by clicking keep lattice, after you confirm the operation, a lattice will be kept behind in the cutter collection that can then be accessed and used to make further modifications to the shape in the event that you weren't able to get it modified to the level that you wanted to while using Boxcutter's taper operation. So here I'm able to just go in and adjust the taper of this object after the fact. Let's do it again. I'll draw another shape. This shape's automatically being tapered, so once we click and apply, I can just enable its lattice as well, and from here just perform a box select and just move this shape however I need to in order to get a very specific type of shape for this particular area. But just in the event that you want to reserve your lattice after a taper operation, there's an option for it now. This option is also available underneath shape. If we look under taper, there's an option for persistent and keep taper lattice, just like we were looking at inside of the helper. So in the event that you want to keep the lattice of your taper for adjustment after the fact and not affect any other operations, there's now an option just for that. So in closing, guys, I just want to say that Boxcutter 719_7 is a pretty massive update. Besides the improvements with Ngon point taking it to another level, Bevel is completely disassembled and still in the process of being reassembled in a better form, so you'll be seeing it change dramatically over the next couple of updates. However, a lot of bug fixes and long-time bugs whenever it came to the way that Boxcutter handled data and shared data and dealt with sort has been resolved. And even the way that we maintain our curves across custom bevels and Boxcutter has now been improved. So there should be noticeable improvements all around, and definitely improvements for stability most of all. There's still a lot for us to do in Blender 3.0, and even more for us to do for Blender 3.1. There should be a bug fix coming out at some point to deal with some irregularities happening in 3.1, but I just wanted to wrap this video saying that quite a bit of work went into this latest update, so I hope users are definitely enjoying it and are able to get the most out of what we've put forth. And with that, I'll wrap up this video, and I'll see you guys next time.